Thank you very much for joining us. Um, my name is Paul Gunter, and I am the director of the Reactor Oversight Program for Beyond Nuclear, and I'll be your host for this Zoom webinar, Debunking the Myths of Small Modular Reactors. This event is co-hosted by our Canadian colleagues, the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development, New Brunswick, and we are joined by a very distinguished panel. I'd like to thank right off for your participation. Um, I'd like to introduce first Kerrie Blaise. She is the staff lawyer for the Canadian Environmental Law Association. Ms. Blaise is a member of the Canadian and International Nuclear Law Associations. She practices energy law specific to nuclear regulation and frequently represents public interest litigants at environmental assessment and licensing hearings before the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. Ms. Blaise has also published in peer-reviewed materials, international law texts on the topics of civil nuclear emergency preparedness and sustainability impacts for small modular reactors. We'll then be joined by Dr. Ed Lyman, who's the director of the Nuclear Power Safety Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Ed is an internationally recognized expert on nuclear proliferation, nuclear terrorism, as well as nuclear power safety and security. He's a member of the Institute of Nuclear Materials Management and has testified numerous times before Congress and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Since joining the UCS in 2003, he's published numerous articles in journals, magazines, and has been cited in thousands of news stories. Dr. Lyman also has co-authored the critically acclaimed book, Fukushima, the Story of a Nuclear Disaster, and was awarded the 2018 Leo Szilard Lectureship Award from the American Physical Society. We'll then be joined by Dr. M.V. Ramana, who is the Simons Chair in Disarmament, Global and Human Security at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Ramana is the author of The Power of Promise, Examining Nuclear Energy in India, and is a former member of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists Science and Security Board. Ramana is a member of the International Panel on Fissile Materials, the International Nuclear Risk Assessment Group, and the team that produces the annual World Nuclear Industry Status Report. He is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and the Leo Szilard Award for the American Physical Society. I'd now like to introduce Susan O'Donnell, who is the lead researcher and with the Rural Action and Voices for the Environment, which is a member of our co-host group, the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development at New Brunswick. Susan?
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Paul, and hello, everyone. I'd just like to start the way that we start respectfully meetings in Canada with a land acknowledgement. So I'm located today on the traditional territory of the Wolastoq people, which is the beautiful and bountiful river, the St. John River, and I'm very grateful for the stewardship for many thousands of years of the Wolastoq people who left the land in a beautiful condition that we found it in when the settlers came, and then look what we've done with it. As Paul said, I'm a researcher at the University of New Brunswick, and my project is a member of the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick. New Brunswick is a Canadian province on the Atlantic Ocean, and we also have the only operational nuclear power reactor in Canada outside of the province of Ontario. It's located on the Atlantic Ocean in the Bay of Fundy. And we're expecting within days, certainly in the coming weeks, an announcement of federal funding for 2 new nuclear reactors, SMRs, and our group, CRED-NB, is very concerned. We have many questions about these reactors, and so we're very delighted to be co-hosting this event with Beyond Nuclear. And thank you very much for organizing it, Beyond Nuclear, because we have many questions. And thank you for organizing this panel. We're looking forward to learning a lot more. So I'm just going to turn my camera off and let you all go to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. I'm Linda Pentz Gunter. I'm the international specialist at Beyond Nuclear, and I'm going to be moderating the webinar today. It's a pretty low-key job because really that just involves looking at the questions which we will read out at the end of the presentations. I'm just going to explain a little bit about how this works. You heard a little bit as you were coming in, some of you. We now have 230 attendees, which is a pretty remarkable turnout. So I just want to reiterate that this is being recorded. When the webinar is complete, we will put this up on YouTube and circulate the link to all of you, and also we'll post it on our respective websites and social media sites. So if you have to leave early, or if you know people who wanted to see it but couldn't come, they will be able to see it on YouTube. You'll see that we have not got a chat function. We just have a Q&A. We ask that you put questions into the Q&A. I know some of you want to put comments and back and forth, but it's easier for us to mine out the questions at the end if that's what's in there. So please put questions in the Q&A. We'll be looking at these as the speakers speak and then asking some of them at the end. We'll just take a read on the room as we approach the 90-minute mark when we're supposed to wrap up. If a lot of you are still here and we haven't got through a lot of the questions that still need to be asked, we might continue on for about another 10 minutes or so. In addition to that, we will be able to capture all the Q&A with your emails from your registration. So if your question is not asked today, we will endeavor to forward them to the respective experts and see if they can respond to you by email. So hopefully we'll cover everything that you've asked. During the Q&A, I will be calling on Dr. Gordon Edwards from the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility to say a few things based on perhaps things that may not have been covered during the presentations, and specifically from the Canadian point of view. And likewise, I will also turn on the microphone for Dr. David Lowry, who's a nuclear expert, longtime nuclear expert in the United Kingdom, who has done a lot of writing also on small modular reactors. And I'll ask David to say a few things from the UK perspective as well. We've got an extraordinary collection of participants today. Most of you are from US and Canada, quite a number from the UK. We've seen people coming in from the Philippines, Estonia, Ukraine. So it's a remarkable turnout, and we're really grateful that you've all taken some time in your afternoon or evening or possibly the middle of the night to participate. So now, without further ado, I am going to open up the presentation section of the webinar, and we'll ask Kerrie Blaise to go first. Thank you, Kerrie.
Thank you, Linda, and welcome everyone. Bear with me as I share my screen. So thank you for the invite to speak today. So I am joining you from Canada, and as I'm from the Canadian Environmental Law Association, our work is focused on Ontario, but today I'll be looking at federal law and will be Canada-wide in scope. So my pleasure to join you all, and thank you for the hundreds who are watching online and for those who will join us later. So I'm a staff lawyer at CELA, and CELA is the Canadian Environmental Law Association. We're a specialty clinic of Legal Aid Ontario, and we represent low-income and disadvantaged communities in public interest environmental matters. We are celebrating our 50th anniversary, and as we were funded in 1970, and we are the only clinic in Ontario providing these services. So today, what I'm going to briefly do in passing is introduce what our supposed small modular reactors, and then look at Canada's plans for SMRs. And then we're going to delve into some key implications SMRs may have for the Canadian environment, health and safety, and the public interest. And then I will conclude with some remarks as to how we can scale up the dialogue and scale up the action to oppose SMRs. So first, let's begin with, there's no one accepted definition of what is an SMR, a small modular reactor. It's generally believed that they are a compact nuclear reactor producing between 1 to 300 megawatts of electricity or heat. And there are dozens, if not hundreds, of proposed designs. And the term modular in their name refers to SMR proponents' hope that they can be assembled in a factory and produced in a modular fashion rather than built on site like our conventional nuclear power plants. So the plan for SMRs in Canada can find its basis in a 2018 report that was authored by the Canadian Nuclear Association called A Call to Action, a Canadian Roadmap for Small Modular Reactors. And this was the vision that the industry set out. And in this vision, in this roadmap, as I'll call it throughout my presentation, it described SMR technology as a source of safe, clean, affordable energy, and presenting an opportunity for a low carbon future. And these are many of the statements that my presentation and those of my panelists later will seek to debunk. The roadmap also championed the suitability of these small modular reactors for remote and off-grid communities. They also championed their use for replacing on-grid fossil fuel extraction and also for powering resource projects such as, for those of you in Canada, perhaps you're familiar with the Ring of Fire proposal in Ontario's far north. In the roadmap, it also contained a concrete set of recommendations aimed at guiding government, industry, and other nuclear stakeholders to capitalize on this initiative, or this opportunity. And while we're not going to go through all the recommendations, I'm highlighting two today. And two of the recommendations found in this roadmap are that we restrict the application of federal environmental impact assessment law to SMRs. And secondly, that we incorporate new waste streams into existing long-term radioactive waste management plans. So these are the two components I'd like you to keep in mind as we proceed through the slides. So the first implication of exempting SMRs or limiting the application of Canada's environmental impact assessment legislation has critical impacts for the public's right to know and also the public's involvement in decision-making around SMRs. So let's pause for a moment, and so we're all on the same page. Environmental or impact assessments, they go by two names often. It's about looking before you leap. So it requires that for any project, you study the ecological, the socioeconomic, the cultural impacts of the project prior to it being developed. And this process, impact assessment, it allows us to avoid, minimize, mitigate adverse impacts. And it also allows us to prevent disproportionate impacts on vulnerable or at-risk communities and ecosystems. And it ensures a mechanism for the public voice to be heard in decision-making. So having laid that framework, I regret to inform you, and for those who are listening from outside of Canada, Canada's federal impact assessment law does not apply to small modular reactors. And I'll walk you through why that is. So the Federal Impact Assessment Act has adopted a listing approach. So if a project falls on the list and your project is on the list, you will trigger an impact assessment. However, the list states that only reactors 200 megawatts or larger require an impact assessment. So a snapshot of the designs that are proposed throughout Canada. So SMR by terrestrial energy proposed for Ontario is 192, not meeting the 200 megawatt threshold. The X Energy is 80 megawatts, the Moltex is 150, and the new scale power SMR proposed for Saskatchewan is 60. However, What is not considered in these numbers is that the X energy is proposed to be a 2-pack, as I read in a media article, and the new scale power reactor is supposed to be a 4-pack. And so when you multiply these individual modules by 2, by 4, you are getting a much larger reactor. However, the phrasing of the Act still will not cover the totality of the site or the totality of the reactor being proposed. Rather, it takes a reactor by reactor approach. As these designs fall below that 200 megawatt threshold, no federal impact assessment would be required. The result of this is that proponents, SMR advocates, can make unilateral determinations about the acceptability of the project, about its risks or non-risks, about its environmental implications, without that public input, without that expert review that would feed into an impact assessment process. A second assertion I want to address briefly is the assertion that the waste from SMRs can just fit into our existing plans for nuclear waste. In Canada, it's the Nuclear Waste Management Organization that is mandated to develop plans and manage the long-term future of Canada's nuclear fuel waste. All of its comparisons of risks and benefits and options to pursue, including its dialogue with the public, has assumed a finite volume of used nuclear fuel, and it was based on a projected trajectory of how much waste we will create with our existing fleet of reactors. It also assumed a certain type of waste, being CANDU reactor spent fuel. So to now assume we can neatly fit SMR waste into this has not been assessed. The characterization of the new fuel waste components, the magnitude of harm, and the interaction of the waste has not been assessed, and nor has there been any public communication from the NWMO stating how SMR waste will fit within their existing framework and plans. I also wish to flag the implication of citing SMRs in off-grid remote communities. In Canada, off-grid remote communities are predominantly Indigenous, and so that means that First Nation communities could become hosts for the majority of these SMRs. Reconciliation needs to be a guiding purpose for all projects, for all activities, and the respect for Indigenous values and traditional knowledge, and crucially, providing opportunities for their equal and effective and fair participation. In Canada, there is a constitutional duty to consult, which requires that consultation be undertaken prior to a decision being made, which could affect First Nations constitutionally protected traditional and Aboriginal rights. To date, the Anishinaabe Nation has unanimously endorsed a resolution opposing the construction of SMRs in Ontario. And much earlier, in 2005, the Anishinaabe Aski Nation passed a resolution declaring their traditional territory a nuclear waste-free zone. So if we are to advance reconciliation, Indigenous engagement needs to be happening from the outset and not down the road when designs are proposed and being developed. So in closing, I want to leave you with a few remarks and messages that you're welcome to adopt, amend, edit, make your own. So in order to debunk the myths around small modular reactors, we need to replace the promotional industry rhetoric and change it with accountability for the environmental debts for the mining, the accidents, the legacy waste, which flow from these proposals. We also need to work to end the discrimination and marginalization experienced by Indigenous peoples in Canada and respect their right to individual and collective rights, which requires their early engagement in decision-making. We also need to uphold the best interest of the child, and pursuant to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, this includes protecting future generations who will inherit the legacy we leave behind. We also need to work to improve our legal frameworks and empower the public's right to information and right to know and right to participate. And we need to embrace opportunities so we can transition to more sustainable, healthier, and equitable economies. And who would you share these messages with? I encourage you to email, call, reach out to your member of parliament, of provincial or federal parliament, the premier, the prime minister, any minister who shares an environment, infrastructure, or northern mandate. And there are links on the slides. And so if you do want to participate in the review of an environmental assessment for the only SMR in Canada that's currently undergoing an EA under a former law, you're welcome to do so. I provided the link there. If you want to request that the SMR that is destined for your community or proposed in your province undergo an impact assessment, there is a route to do that, and I provided a link as well. And lastly, this is an issue that the Canadian Environmental Law Association continues to be involved in. So you're welcome to sign up for a monthly e-bulletin, and we do provide updates on these matters and flag when there are consultation opportunities. And without further ado, I will end there and turn back to my co-panelists.
Thank you, Kerrie. We'll just wait till the slides are gone. There we are. And actually, it was a quick question about whether those slides might be made available later on. And I said that we would check in with you and see what the best way is of making those PowerPoints available, so the answer is yes to that question. I'm now happy to reintroduce Dr. Edwin Lyman, who will present next. So Ed, you may unmute and commence.
So I'm going to be talking today very briefly about a big subject, and that's the safety and security of small modular reactors. And as we just heard from Ms. Blaise, there's a large number of different potential reactor types that are classified as small modular reactors. And so it's hard to encapsulate all the areas of concern with this menagerie of reactors that have been proposed. But some are more developed or more advanced than others in the regulatory process. And there's been a lot of work here in the United States at the Nuclear Regulatory Committee to change its approach to licensing what they call advanced reactors and also small modular light water reactors. And since there's a lot of a big connection to Canada in this webinar, I'd point out that the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission signed a memorandum of understanding last year to, quote, share best practices, unquote, with regards to the licensing of these creatures. And so if something is happening here in the United States and it hasn't come down the pike yet in Canada, it may well. So the big question really is, are small modular reactors, that is a nuclear reactor that's 300 megawatts electric or less, according to conventional definition, is there something magical about them that they're fundamentally safer and more secure than the conventional large reactors that are typically around 1,000 megawatts electric? And so the arguments that are being made by proponents are, one, that a smaller reactor is easier to cool than a large reactor. It generates less heat. And so it might even allow for efficient passive safety. In other words, you don't need electrically driven pumps to force coolant through the radioactive core when it's shut down to remove the decay heat and prevent that core from overheating and potentially destroying itself. That you could do this without the need for backup electrical power or other motor-driven systems. The other obvious observation is that a smaller reactor will have less radioactive material in its core, generally speaking, and less material available to disperse it if an accident or even a terrorist attack occurs. And so therefore there'll be a smaller potential for environmental contamination and public health and safety impacts. And finally, for the reactors that are different from conventional water-cooled reactors, some designers claim that these different designs are inherently safer than those reactors, and one should give credit to that. That could apply both to small and large reactors as well. So going back to this main question, are these fundamentally safer and more secure? And the answer is no. It really all depends on the details, especially when you're talking about sites with multiple units, as we just heard from Ms. Blaise. So even if the amount of radioactivity in each module is small, the amount that could actually be released from a plant, that is one or more reactors at a site, really depends on first the number of modules at the site, also how they might interact during an accident, and are there common cause failures that could lead to multiple meltdowns at the same time, that is an earthquake or a flooding incident such as the world saw at Fukushima Daiichi in 2011, where you had essentially 6 nuclear reactors affected at the same time by severe flooding, or a sabotage attack, where if an armed adversary group were to actually get access to a site, it may take them not much longer to sabotage multiple reactors at once than it would to sabotage one, depending on how it's laid out. And then there's finally spent fuel storage. So all nuclear reactors generate nuclear waste. I know here in the United States, as in Canada, there's no place to take that waste from reactor sites. So it's going to be there, possibly indefinitely. And so even if you had a small reactor, it's going to eventually accumulate a large amount of spent nuclear fuel, and that could be a source of radioactivity in an accident or a terrorist attack that would be larger than one might expect from the reactor itself. So what about the claims for passive safety? Well, just taking one example, NuScale, which is a small modular light water reactor that's well on the way to being licensed by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The developers have been arguing this reactor is passively safe, walk-away safe, that you can lose electrical power, everything can go wrong, and you just have to wait for it to stop cooking and settle down, and operators don't need to do anything. Well, it turns out that picture is false. In fact, the company itself either did not disclose or didn't understand a design flaw of the reactor, which might be its Achilles heel, which might be the most serious design flaw in the reactor, in which case the normal operation of these passive cooling systems could lead to unstable conditions that could cause a reactivity excursion, that is severe power increase, core melt. So rather than the passive systems letting everything settle down safely, it could actually make things worse. Now, the NRC staff, despite these revelations late in the licensing game, last month they issued an approval of the NuScale design. That's the staff level approval, not yet the commission approval, which is important. But the staff approved it essentially by placing all these safety concerns in a parking lot and saying it doesn't have to be dealt with now. That's something an applicant who wants to actually build the plant will have to deal with. But at least one member of the NRC's advisory committee, an independent internal advisory committee on reactor safeguards, believes that this was improper and really was driven by an arbitrary deadline to approve the design so that NuScale could put out its press release saying it had met this milestone. And there's at least one member of NRC's technical staff who wrote what's called a non-concurrence to that decision, an objection to issuing the safety approval that pointed out that actually operators may have to do things and they may make a mistake, and that mistake could actually lead to a high risk of core damage, possibly up to 1 in 2,500 risk of a core melt accident per year for a 12-module plant. And that risk is higher than an existing light water reactor. So this reactor could actually be less safe than the current generation. There's also the issue that even if a reactor were safer intrinsically, that nuclear safety is not just the reactor operation, but there are a lot of factors related to how it's designed, built, and operated that could affect safety. And the vendors and the promoters of small modular reactors are saying, give us credit, the reactor's safer, So we don't need all these other features that are in place for operating reactors today, like locating reactors at a distance from densely populated urban areas, maintaining off-site radiological emergency planning so that an evacuation or other measures can be carried out quickly in the event of an accident. Some claim they can reduce or even eliminate control room operators. The reactor can be autonomous and chug along by itself. They claim you don't need a security force to protect it from sabotage because, hey, even if someone tries to attack it, nothing will happen. They have smaller or no conventional containment at all, and so forth. So even if the designs were safer, if you look at the sum total of all the regulatory rollbacks that the vendors are seeking and that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission seems ready to approve, you may end up with something which is far less safe than what we have now. Just take the example of emergency planning zones. Well, obviously, if you have a smaller reactor, releases a smaller amount of radioactivity, the NRC is providing a means by which applicants can do a calculation to show that you wouldn't need to evacuate people in the event of an accident. But of course, those calculations have a million different assumptions that can be manipulated to give you the answer you want, and that's the problem. But even so, even a small reactor, really small, still has a lot of dangerous radioactive material in it. And here's just one example of a recent study done by Idaho National Laboratory, which is hosting the National Reactor Innovation Center, where most of the new demonstration reactors are supposed to be built. And this must have been the only honest employee of the lab who did a study to show exactly how bad a reactor accident could go for a very small reactor. It's called a microreactor. We're talking about something 20 megawatts thermal, which would be about 80 or a factor of 8 smaller than a single NuScale module. And they looked at the potential doses just from, if you have a core melt and a radiological release, someone who's at the site boundary, that's 4.7 kilometers away, immersed in the cloud of radiation that comes out, not even counting what's called ground shine, that is radiation that's that deposits on the ground and is there until you remove it. That dose alone from inhalation of this cloud could lead to very high doses. Just look at for a sodium fast reactor like the ARC-100, which is under consideration in New Brunswick, the total inhalation dose would be 254 rem. That's 2.54 sieverts, and that is that's a level where you might see acute radiation syndrome effects. But even if you were 10 miles away, that's about 3 times that distance, you would still be well in excess of doses that, for instance, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency would say are warranted for evacuation. So you see that just based on the amount of radioactivity alone, you can't discount the need for off-site emergency planning. One last word, pivoting to another interesting issue. There are also molten salt reactors, such as Terrestrial Energy, which just got a small cash award from the Canadian government. These are reactors where the fuel itself is not a solid, but it's a molten salt liquid. And as such, that reactor gives off massive amounts of radioactive gas and particulate matter as a matter of normal operation. And there are a lot of obvious consequences to that, but one which is not so obvious is its potential impact on the ability of the world to monitor and exclude or to detect nuclear weapons tests. So one of the radioactive signatures of a nuclear weapons test are isotopes of xenon, which are short-lived but very intense. And the system of monitoring stations that is in place to verify a comprehensive test ban treaty, should it ever come into force, could be blinded by the deployment of small molten salt reactors, even small ones. And here's just a picture of what might happen to the monitoring stations if at a level well below what a fleet of molten salt reactors might produce. In fact, a definitive study has showed that a single, well, based on a definitive study's results, a single terrestrial energy molten salt reactor unit at only 400 megawatts thermal would produce 7 orders of magnitude. That's 10 million times the level that is recommended to be able to maintain the functionality of the International Monitoring System for the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So these reactors could actually undermine a global nuclear security. And that's another concern that we need to think about. And I probably went over. I apologize, and I'm happy to answer your question.
Thanks, Ed. We have had quite a few questions pop up in the Q&A, so we will get to those after all the presentations are done. So I'm now going to hand over to Professor Ramana, who will wrap up with his presentation. Thank you, Ramana. You may unmute and begin.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Susan. I am very honored to be part of this panel. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the aspects of small modular reactors that Kerrie and Ed haven't really talked about. I've been looking at SMRs for nearly a decade and looked at a range of different issues, which I'll try to touch upon very briefly during this presentation. So the first thing I want to tell you is that these small reactors aren't new. Nuclear power started with small reactors. The United States, for example, built all of these reactors, which all will fit under the definition of small in terms of their generation capacity. This particular history of small reactors was not particularly pleasant. So in many of these reactors that were built were shut down quite early on. They all suffered from large construction cost overruns. And they found that the costs of building this plant and operating them was not producing electricity at a cost that was competitive with other alternatives. And so many of them were shut down when, for example, they had some equipment failing which had to be replaced, and the operators decided it was not worth fixing the plant. They would rather just shut it down. And the other aspect of this experience with small reactors in the United States tells us that many reactors that look good on paper might not be operating so well in practice. And the example I'd like to give here is that of Fort St. Vrain, a reactor that operated, a high-temperature gas-cooled reactor that operated in the state of Colorado between 1974 and 1988. And a lot of the time, the reactor was actually shut down. It was not generating nearly as much electricity as it should. And the average load factor was about 15% in all. And so the New York Times had this lovely headline, which said, "The world's safest reactor is closing because it rarely runs." Because that's one way by which you can make a reactor safe, which is not to operate it at all. So the lesson that you learn from some of these experiences is that designs that might seem very captivating on paper might not actually work so well in real life. The second thing, which I kind of alluded to in the case of Elk River and some of the other reactors, is that they're all small reactors. And when they are small, they cannot take advantage of what's called economies of scale. And this is exactly why the nuclear industry moved from building small reactors to building larger reactors. So in the United States, I mentioned a bunch of them. In Canada, for example, the first heavy water reactors, the CANDU reactors, had an output of around 200 megawatts, and subsequent designs went up to about 900 megawatts. And this is because when you build a reactor that's, let's say, designed to generate 10 times as much electricity, the amount of concrete that you might use or the number of workers that are required to operate the plant do not scale up by a factor of 10. You require considerably less amount of concrete than a factor of 10 increase over a smaller reactor, and likewise for the number of workers and other operational costs. And therefore, the cost per unit of electricity generation capacity goes down when you go to larger reactors. This is the reason why the nuclear industry decided to go large. Now, when you go back to small modular reactors, you're actually going against that logic. You're going back to small reactors, which means that your unit cost is going to be much higher. The other result of going small is that you will be producing more spent fuel and waste as compared to a large reactor, all else being equal. This is because the small reactors tend to be more less efficient in terms of how they use neutrons. And this is exactly why the point that Ed mentioned about smaller reactors having a sort of a smaller size, a smaller fissile inventory, it also means that there's more surface area to radiate out heat, but also neutrons to escape. And there are also other features of small modular reactors that make them use more uranium, more fuel for producing the same amount of electricity, and generating more spent fuel and waste. The expectation from proponents of small modular reactors is that they can compensate for that by what they might call learning or by mass manufacture. There are sort of two issues I want to flag there. The first is that the experience we've had with nuclear power so far suggests that costs actually go up as you learn more about nuclear reactors. So in the two countries that have the most number of nuclear reactors, France and the United States, costs have actually, as this plot on the right side shows, costs have actually gone up as the fleet has expanded. So this is completely unlike any other energy technology. And this is primarily because as you learn more about nuclear power plants, you probably realize more safety problems which have to be fixed, which cost money eventually. The second point is that even if there was some learning and you assume that there is some optimistic, positive learning factor, what you find is that you have to build a very large number of reactors before you can even break even with the cost that you've lost because of the lack of economies of scale. And we've estimated some of these numbers, and they turn out to be quite large, ranging from a few hundreds to a few tens of thousands. And the question is whether there's going to be a market for these kind of large number of loss leaders, so-called first-of-a-kind plants or things of that sort, to actually do the learning, assuming that the learning actually happens. And these are all, therefore, a whole bunch of assumptions which, from what we know of the history of nuclear power, are not likely to be realized. These are the claims made by the small modular reactor people. The other thing that we've learned from the history of nuclear power so far is that initial cost estimates typically tend not to be reliable. So one large-scale study of nuclear power projects around the world showed that about 175 out of 180 projects exceeded their budget. And an average cost overrun was about 117%. And each project, the average cost overrun was about $1.3 billion. And almost 64% of them, all of them took on average about 64% time more than projected. And we see this not just in old projects, but also in current projects. So for example, the two reactors, AP1000 reactors that are being built in Vogel in Georgia, which is still not complete, you've seen that the costs have gone up by roughly a factor of 5 at this point. And the project is not complete. There's still the possibility of cost overruns. This kind of cost increase was behind the other AP1000 project that was ongoing in South Carolina, which ultimately was abandoned because the Westinghouse company, which was both selling the reactor design and was involved in the construction, filed for bankruptcy protection. In the case of the one reactor that's in the United States that's actually somewhat close to possible construction, we've seen the same kind of cost overruns. So the early estimates when the precursor to the new scale design was launched, was described, was about $1,700 per kilowatt. The current estimates for the UAMPS project with new scale is about $8,500 per kilowatt without a DOE subsidy. The DOE has reportedly is going to give about $1.35 to $1.4 billion, in which case it will come down to about $6,600 per kilowatt. But of course, there is actually a cost to the taxpayer. And given this reality of increasing costs, the claims that companies like NuScale make that they can deliver electricity cheaply do not bear critical scrutiny. The other point I want to mention, I mean, when all of this is happening, the alternatives to nuclear power, including renewable energy sources, which are considered to be climate friendly, as is the case with nuclear power, are all becoming much cheaper. And so we see that wind and solar, and even wind and solar with some storage to compensate for the intermittency, because these power sources do not generate when the sun is not shining or the wind is not blowing. We find that those costs are also coming down. And these costs have been reducing quite dramatically over the last decade. And by the time SMRs are actually deployed, if they are deployed, we will find that these are going to become even more cheaper. The one argument that you see from SMR proponents that they can actually try to back up the intermittency of renewables is, technically could be true, but the impact of doing so is that the cost of generating electricity from SMRs will also go up. So some years ago, NuScale came up with this graph in one of their papers where they said, we can use NuScale to compensate for the intermittency of the output of a wind farm, the Horsewood wind farm. And what I calculated was that if they did run NuScale in this fashion, their levelized cost, the cost of generating electricity at this, will increase by about 20%. So an already uneconomical source of power will become even more uneconomical. The SMRs have also been significantly delayed compared to early promises. So here is a screen. Here's a slide that was actually presented by a Nuclear Regulatory Commission spokesperson in 2007, 2008, where they were predicting, for example, that NuScale would be done by 2015, and by 2016, NuScale was saying that they would actually be generating electricity. It's now 2020, and the current prognosis is that the reactor will not be ready before 2029-30. And many of the others that are shown on this slide actually have been cancelled. Essentially, it's not going forward anywhere as far as I know. Including, for example, the Toshiba 4S or the IRIS reactor design. Westinghouse actually just given up on that. So this again is sort of going to be like the old nuclear reactor story, where there have been lengthy delays in terms of trying to license new reactor designs, to construct them, and several designs that were proposed never ever got constructed. So let me just end with a few remarks about Canada. Kerrie sort of mentioned that Canada has been a big area where a lot of SMR vendors are trying to set up shop, and many official agencies in Canada, such as the Natural Resources Canada, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, Canada Nuclear Laboratories, all of them have been trying to portray Canada as a good market for small modular reactors. And Kerrie also mentioned this point that in Canada's selling point, in the selling point for SMRs in Canada, is that there are regions of Canada which are not connected to the grid because they are fairly remote. These include communities that live there and industries such as mining industries that operate in these places. And the claim from SMR vendors is that these, because they are right now supplied with electricity by diesel, and the diesel has to be shipped over these long distances, over roads which may not be operable all the time, end up being quite an expensive source of electricity for these locations. Along with two of my colleagues, we did some calculations, and what we found was that the cost of generating electricity from an SMR would be roughly about 10 times or more that of generating electricity right now by diesel. And the cost of generating electricity could go down significantly in many of these locations if they were to deploy some amount of wind or solar power in these locations. There are already quite a few places which are experimenting with wind and solar, and this is an expanding field at this point. The argument that sometimes you hear saying, if only countries were to adopt a carbon tax in order to account for the fossil fuel emissions from diesel and so on, what you find is that even including that, a hybrid system involving wind and diesel or something like that would be far cheaper, even with a carbon tax of about $100 per ton. And more important than that, what we also found was that these so-called areas where there is remote locations and off-grid demand, the amount of demand is actually quite small. It's on the order of 600 megawatts. And so if you look at how many reactors this is actually going to mean, it's probably going to mean, if you're thinking about really small reactors like 3 megawatts, you're talking about 200 reactors being sold or something of that sort. And even this is, of course, unlikely because it's going to be much more expensive. But just to give them the best possible scenario, what you find is that at this kind of demand, this is too small for even trying to build a factory that would do the modular production of these small reactors. And there were estimates of what is required by companies like Westinghouse and Empower to actually set up one of these factories, how many of these orders they would require. And this level of demand is too small to even meet that thing. So therefore, it won't be worth setting up even a factory to manufacture them. And you see this to some extent in the case of NewScale. For all their talk about modular construction and trying to have a factory, what they are planning to do is actually build their modules in a number of different locations, including in Canada, through the BWXT and through Doosan in South Korea and so on. And therefore, they are not going to be able to actually sort of even try out some of the factory manufacturing techniques that they have been talking about as ways to reduce cost. Okay, so let me finish by saying a couple of take-home messages. One is that SMRs will be more expensive per unit of electricity generation capacity and per unit of electricity generated. It will generate more radioactive waste per kilowatt hours when compared to large reactors. There's a long history of claims about construction times, costs, operational efficiencies, and most of them have been shown to be false, and they're unlikely to have a stable, large enough market. So at best, if there are SMRs that are constructed, it'll be at a boutique level, which is strongly subsidized by the government. And when they are constructed, people will see that they're actually too expensive. So where does this leave SMR advocates? Basically, you have these two choices, right? Either you have to believe, as Alice was told in Alice in Wonderland, that you have to believe in impossible things, or you can be like Gatsby in Great Gatsby and hope that someday in the future, it'll all work out. I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ramana. I invite our panelists to return to the screen. It looks like we might have lost Ed temporarily, hopefully. But I'd like to invite you to return with your cameras and audio on, and we'll go to the Q&A. I just wanted reiterate a couple of things before we do that. Yes, this is being recorded. We will post this to YouTube, and we'll send the link around to all of you who participated today, and those who registered as well and couldn't participate, and post the video to our various websites and social media sites. So it will be viewable later. We've been asked if the PowerPoints can be made available too. I'm sure that's fine. We will do the same thing. We will make sure that links to all the PowerPoints are available on our respective websites and so forth. And then some people have asked where they can get sort of very simple, straightforward fact sheets and information about SMRs. One person asked if it could be sort of non-biased. This is always, a rather, I think, subjective question, because we do on our Beyond Nuclear website have a publications page which has a pamphlet explaining SMRs and a couple of web fact sheets which were actually contributed to by Ramana and Ed. And so they are scientifically sourced and unbiased. Whether they come from us gives a different perception, I think, is probably in the eye of the beholder. But we'd encourage you to go to beyondnuclear.org and mine those. There have been a lot of questions. I think some of them perhaps have already been answered on the air, but I'm just going to go through and touch on them. And if it sort of reiterates some things that are said, maybe it's good to hear them again, just so we can be clear. And so from Russell Lowes and also Maggie Gunderson asked 2 questions about costs. Sorry, I know we have a cat disappearing in the background there. It's gone now. Question about the costs. What are the most reliable estimates, Russell Lowes asks, cost estimates for new SMRs per construction cost and per kilowatt hour electric produced? And how are the projections developed? Do they rely on existing reactor costs adjusted for varying differences, or solely on developers' sale pitches or otherwise? And Maggie Gunderson also asked how they are economically justified, who picks up the tab for the cost overruns. So I guess, Ramana, that's probably a question for you in terms of the calculations.
Yeah, so there are a range of cost estimates. There are definitely vendor cost estimates which are made with sort of a sales pitch in mind. So these tend to be starting very low, and they would make all kinds of claims about how they have learned from earlier experiences to lower their costs. And then there are also cost estimates made by looking at existing designs and trying to scale down, or by the third possibility is through what are called expert, what is it called? Basically, you ask a bunch of experts, expert elicitation, sorry, I was blanking out on that name. So there are sort of these three ways by which people have tried to come up. There are engineering cost estimates which have to be done by the developer because they only know the design details. Cost estimates made by comparing with large reactors and scaling using well-known scaling laws, and expert elicitation numbers. And there is no such thing as a reliable figure until actually you build one. And that cost which you've come up with the end is the only reliable figure that you can have. Till that point, basically, you have to contend with this uncertainty and try to figure out what you want to do. Now, the other question that Maggie asked about who's going to pick up cost overruns, that very much depends on the details of the contract. So in the early years, in some cases, there were companies that went into turnkey project contracts where they basically promised a project at a certain cost and promised to absorb all the additional costs. Now that kind of that proved to be a hugely unprofitable strategy, because most of these did have cost overruns and the companies did have to pay. So what has typically been happening is that the contracts will end up forcing the clients, the customers for the plant, to actually pick up the tab. And this is what we see in Georgia, in South Carolina, where even though the plant was not constructed, the residents of South Carolina have to pay for it with their bills.
So we
I
got
know there are a lot of questions, so I'm going to try to be brief.
Yeah, you're going to have to hold the fort a little bit because we seem to have lost Ed. Hopefully he'll get back on soon. On the technical end of things, we got an interesting question, actually came in advance. I don't know if she's on now, Gabrielle Viget, who wrote in French, but we translated it. And I think it's an interesting question. She says, why do our politicians want these small modular reactors? What motivates them? And I think that, the piece that maybe we didn't touch on is the climate change. That if in fact the answer to that is that they are saying that this is a way to address climate change, it's clear that that's very unlikely, given how long it would take and how small they are. So I'm just interested in both of your takes on why you think we have such a struggle to convince politicians that this is a completely futile path to take. And some people have asked, do we have handouts for them? And again, I would direct them to the Beyond Nuclear website, and we'd be happy to retailor them if you have specific needs. But I'm interested in both of you. Maybe Kerrie, you go first in terms of this sort of blind spot that politicians seem to have. Just unmute and then we'll hear from you.
It's a great question, and much of the rhetoric we're seeing around SMRs today is very similar to the nuclear renaissance that was promised in the early 2000s as well, with innovative new reactor designs, and nuclear industry kept building this expectation that this nuclear renaissance was imminent, and again, similar language was used, so it'd be cost effective, it would lower greenhouse gas emissions, and even in 2008, which is not that long ago, the Atomic Energy of Canada declared that we were entering this nuclear renaissance, and despite the rhetoric and the promise, the designs that were actually promised during that era never came to fruition. So I would argue what we're seeing now is actually the last plea by the nuclear sector to advance an industry that is largely in decline, and we see across the board that nuclear power plants are entering an era of decommissioning, and so I think this is the last hurrah, if you will, for the nuclear sector, and again, messages are the same, they're not changing, and it's more our response to those messages and being able to pick up on the fallacy behind them.
Thanks, Kerrie. Ramana, do you want to address that?
Very briefly, I think there are two aspects to talk about. One is that I think many politicians, especially sort of from the kind of the more liberal end of the spectrum, would sort of say, look, we don't want to rule out anything. We want an all of the above strategy, and so nuclear has to be part of the mix. And this is also the message that you hear from the nuclear industry. Very few people in the nuclear industry would say we need only nuclear power. They would say we need renewables, we love renewables, but renewables can't do the job alone. You need nuclear power. That's the message they're going to say. So that's one set of, for a lot of decision makers, they're not going to be able to go and wade into all the sort of arcane arguments that even some of us are making, and therefore they're not going to be sort of easily convinced, and they would be saying, okay, well, let me listen to everybody and please everybody. So that's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is that the nuclear industry is a very powerful industry. It has enormous amount of clout, it has a huge lobbying capacity, and it deploys all of it, and it is always involved in a whole bunch of propaganda campaigns, right? And they build alliances with a whole number of groups. It's not just the nuclear industry, it's nuclear industry with they hire some very smart PR people. In a great PR coup in Canada, they hired the former head of the Solar Energy Association to be the head of the Nuclear Energy Association. And so now this guy says, yeah, I know all about solar power, but I think nuclear power, you need it. And it's great. And that's such a great, message. And so that there are kind of ways by which they operate are very sophisticated. And it's very hard not to fall for them unless you really sort of go straight into all the details and sort of bury your nose into that stuff.
I did just hear from Ed, and he is having internet problems, so he's hoping to fix those and rejoin us, so hopefully that will be the case. I did want to touch on a question about the proliferation and military connection to SMRs, and I'm going to ask this question to the two of you, but I'd like to also bring in at that point David Lowery. So David, I'm going to give you a mic in a minute to address this, because I think this pertains very particularly to the situation in the UK. So the question came from initials DS. He says, can you offer, or she, can you offer any insight into the role of SMRs for military use? What is the involvement of military and defense contractors in the development and future plans for Canadian and US reactors? Thank you. And I think, after you answer, I'll ask David, what his thoughts are on the UK military and Trident connections. But if either of you would like to answer first. Would either of you like to answer? Otherwise, David,
go ahead. Go ahead.
I think live now. Oh, I don't see him. I thought I just gave David the mic, but it doesn't look like he's... Yep, there we go. David, so you are allowed to talk if you'd like to. We won't see you, but we will hear you. So the floor is yours, David, if you'd like to respond to that first. It doesn't look like we can hear him. So why don't you go ahead, Ramana, and then we'll see if David can join us.
Okay. So I think, is there a proliferation connection? I think there are, again, two aspects of that which we have to talk about. The first is, does the acquisition of a SMR give countries the ability to make nuclear weapons if they choose to, right? And there are two levels, again, at which you can see that. One is that all nuclear reactors use uranium, often enriched uranium, and will produce plutonium. And even a small reactor, SMR, like a 200 megawatt reactor, will produce sizable quantities of plutonium, of the order of enough to make about 10 Nagasaki type weapons, for example, right? So the technical capability will come if they choose to execute it. And the second thing that happens with a country buying an SMR is that if it's a country that has no nuclear industry at this point, they get to develop some of the capabilities to do nuclear-related work. And so that's another way by which they're going to become capable of making nuclear weapons. So that's at the sort of demand side. On the production side, in the United States, in the UK, what you see is a very interesting story. And this goes back to also the question about why are politicians supporting it? So for decades, what we've been told is that nuclear power has no connection with nuclear weapons. Right? This is a purely civilian enterprise. It's all about generating electricity. It's for peaceful purposes. Please don't confuse us with the nuclear weapons purpose. Now, when nuclear power is becoming uneconomical, reactors are being shut down, what you see is the nuclear industry turning around and saying, you should support us because we can actually help you with quote-unquote national security. So in the UK, the form it takes is that the nuclear industry says, by allowing building Hinkley Point, for example, or by promoting Rolls-Royce to develop a SMR, they can actually maintain enough people to be able to make the Trident submarine. Likewise, in the United States, the first report that that the former Department of Energy secretary wrote after he stepped down from the Obama administration was calling nuclear power a national security imperative. So basically saying you need to support nuclear power because it also allows you to make nuclear weapons, right? So they actually admit it in a way, but they just don't want to admit it when there are people where it's not convenient for them.
Thanks. And David, if you'd like to add to that, I've unmuted you now, so I think we should be able to hear you. David Lowery, I've given you talk permission. Okay, well, it doesn't look like he's able to talk. I'm not sure why. Welcome back, Ed. I'm glad that you're able to rejoin us. There was a question coming in specifically about Canada, so I'll unmute you, Gordon, in a sec as well. And that was about the alternative energy sources for the east coast of Canada, and particular in New Brunswick. Like, why, why do they even need to do this?
Thank you very much. Well, I believe that one of the reasons why small modular reactors are being promoted so much is because there's such a huge momentum and investment in reactors which are dying. The whole nuclear industry is dying. And because of the nuclear waste, you can't just walk away from it. You have to have expertise to look after the decommissioning and waste management problems, which are going to last for at least 100 years after the last reactor shut down. So there's, in a way, the nuclear industry has a kind of a stranglehold on governments which have invested already in nuclear to continue to invest just to maintain the expertise. And that's one of the motivations. Another motivation, I believe, in Canada is that the premiers, that is the prime ministers of the provinces, 3 or 4 of them, who have expressed enthusiasm for small modular reactors, are actually not enthusiasts about controlling climate change. They're not enthusiastic about reducing greenhouse gas emissions now. So in a way, small modular reactors are kicking the can down the road. It's saying, well, we can say that we're dealing with climate change because we're pouring money into these small modular reactors, when in fact, if the same money was poured into energy efficiency and renewables, you would get much faster, cheaper, quicker returns with much greater jobs. So the logic of the government is completely at odds with the logic of common sense. I would like to point out that I think that we have a problem of rhetoric here. The fact that the industry keeps calling them small modular reactors and we keep using the industry's language, I think we should call them not SMRs, but DDDs, dirty, dangerous distractions. These are dirty, dangerous distractions from dealing with climate change now. And you can elaborate as to why they're dirty, why they're dangerous, and why they're a distraction. And that I think gives us an opening to reach people at a very fundamental level where they don't have to feel that they need to be experts in energy policy or nuclear or know a lot about radioactive waste. I believe that it's very revealing, for example, that the SMR logo, the SMR acronym, leaves out the N for nuclear. It's a small modular nuclear reactor. They leave out precisely the word that makes it different and makes it particularly dangerous. And nuclear is not only having to do with the nuclear waste, which is the only industry on Earth that actually mass produces hundreds of brand new toxic elements. There's no other industry that produces brand new toxic elements. And these elements in themselves are really indestructible in the sense that we don't know how to neutralize them or render them harmless. We can only move them from one place to another or repackage them. So we have a liability which is growing, and that liability continues to grow. Part of the distraction, I believe, in small modular reactors is to dazzle the governments into turning their eyes away from the nuclear waste and nuclear weapons problems, which really do threaten the future, and hold out this false hope that if you just keep pouring money into the nuclear industry to produce new reactors, somehow all these problems will magically disappear, just like the coronavirus will magically disappear if you follow Trump's advice.
Thank you, Gordon, very much. Appreciate that contribution. Kerrie, I don't know if you want to add any more on specifically on the Canadian side of this. We do have also a waste question, no? Okay. So Tim Deere-Jones from the UK, who's a marine radioactivity and research consultant, said, I'm very concerned and interested to find out about the potential for liquid radioactive discharges likely to be released into marine and aquatic environments. Any description of such or pointers to where such detail might be found, I'd be grateful. So is there any possibility of marine discharges? And we've got Ed back. I don't know if you can unmute and join us, Ed. But if you would like to answer that, we'd be happy to hear from you. We can't see you, but we can see you. Great. Welcome back, Ed. So with the liquid waste discharges and waste in general, what's the take on SMRs?
Sure. Well, any nuclear reactor, has, even a light water reactor will have some marine discharges because they have filters for things like the spent fuel pool, and there's always going to be some filtered wastewater that will have some radioactivity in it. But the largest contributions to potential marine waste would be those reactors that involve some sort of spent fuel reprocessing. The fast reactors that are being considered do not necessarily have to have their spent fuel reprocessed, which is putting through a chemical process to separate radioactive fission products from plutonium and other isotopes. Those plants, because they're chemical processing plants, have significant atmospheric and marine discharges, although conventional, current generation processing plants have reduced their marine discharges. Is still going to be something. I don't think there's enough known about the plans for most of these projects. But again, I think the largest concern would be a molten salt reactor, where they're going to be generating large volumes of radioactive waste in their off gas. That's mostly atmospheric discharges, but they may have some waste processing treatment systems that would generate liquid waste as well. But most of the vendors, or all of them, as far as I know, are saying very little about how they're going to manage the radioactive waste from those plants.
Very good. So there's a question actually coming in from Pete Mardist in Estonia, who asks about the various different companies that we've heard mentioned, Moltex, NuScale, and others. Are these all developed by Canadian companies, or are some of these technologies imported from other countries? We know obviously some of them are American, but so who's leading this charge in trying to get these SMRs developed and onto the market, albeit there are no orders and the upfront costs are so high? Any of you free to answer?
I can jump in. The bulk of SMR development, the many designs, there's sort of two characteristics which are important. One is the kind of countries that are spearheading it. So the two countries that we are represented among the speakers in Canada and the US, as well as the UK, particularly Rolls-Royce is sort of being there. Many of these companies are really small companies. They only have a handful of people, and they may have multiple offices. So I don't know whether I want to call them a Canadian company or a UK-based company or the US company, because they're just fairly small ones. NuScale is a very US company. But these three countries, Canada, the US, and the UK, are all countries that have tried in the last couple of decades and either failed or have had lots of difficulty building large reactors, right? Canada abandoned an effort in Ontario. The UK has had huge cost overruns and time overruns with Hinkley Point, same with the United States. This is very different from the experience in China, in Russia, India, and so on. All of them also technically have SMR designs under development, but these are mainly meant as, should there be a market, we should also have a presence there. But they're not really pushing that. So one thing I would mention is that. The second thing which I'd say is that almost all of the companies that are developing SMRs tend to be startups or relatively small companies, or they've grown larger, but they typically have only one product, right? An SMR product. There are companies like Holtec and so on, which are mostly in the waste management business, but have an SMR design, but they're not very serious about it. The same with Westinghouse. When they didn't get DOE money, they pulled out of this SMR market and said, we're going to focus on the AP1000 and decommissioning, right? So all of these companies which are persisting with SMRs essentially have only one design, because what would NuScale do if they were told that SMRs are not going anywhere? They have to shut shop and go away. So they're trying whatever they can. So that's, I think, the two characteristics that I would like to point out.
And Kerrie, I'd like to ask you a question, because we've talked a lot about, how we have to, we know that we need to sort of challenge these through our governments and through federal regulations and so forth. But as a lawyer, are there legal avenues that can be taken to try to head these off or redirect the attention of governments towards investing in renewables and energy efficiency instead of this black hole?
Great question. So what I didn't get to in my talk was the history of our Environmental Assessment Act and the Impact Assessment Act, which we have now, which essentially exempts SMRs, is new. It's a year old, and so that was a very recent decision made by the federal government to remove nuclear from the oversight of the Act. And beyond SMRs, the Act also excludes very major activities like the decommissioning of a nuclear power plant does not trigger an impact assessment. And so there are legal mechanisms, yes, to change the law, reform the law, but it requires a groundswell of public comments and support, and not to dissuade someone from commenting, because even a short email stating your values or concerns contributes to that dialogue. And so, for instance, when Canada was consulting on its Impact Assessment Act, it was critical that we had comments highlighting what should be subject to IA in Canada. And now with the project list in place, it's more crucial to highlight the gaps in what is going to be reviewed and what may be left out. So a large part of my work is law reform initiatives. So trying to address the systemic inadequacies in our laws as it relates to environmental protection and the public to actually participate. So at the federal level, yes, there is a potential to flag for federal ministers that the act in itself, while new, is insufficient, and here's a gap. Likewise, it's important that if your local community, municipality, or even province is considering an SMR, to find support for resolutions, declarations, statements that show at that level they are not socially acceptable in your community. So there are law reform initiatives that can be undertaken independent of any formal engagement process. I'll flag that there is one ongoing environmental assessment under our former environmental assessment law. The Global First Power SMR triggered the Environmental Assessment Act. And so that review remains ongoing. So it is the first, but also the last SMR in Canada to actually undergo an EA. Once that is finished, SMRs do go through a licensing procedure before the before the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. However, I saw in the chat there was questions about climate risks and how climate risks are considered with SMRs, and we have expressly put to Canada's nuclear regulator the need to do a climate assessment or a climate effects assessment of all nuclear licenses. And this is not a provision or a characteristic which they pick up on in their licensing hearings. They do believe that their overarching environmental review of the license is sufficient. So again, to get back to that level of detail, looking at legacy risks, looking at intergenerational risks, and also climate assessments, that would have to be funneled through an impact assessment process. But again, it's not applicable, hence the need for law reform.
Actually, there's a follow-up question on that from Linda Rogers about how the laws on SMRs in other countries impact Canada's lack of legal oversight.
That is an excellent question. And I think you've probably identified a potential research memo to actually compare, what other countries are doing when it comes to impact assessments for SMRs. And I'm not sure if others here can speak to that, but it's an excellent research topic.
And Ed, there's a question here from Roger Witherspoon about what are some of the dangers of operating a molten salt reactor. Didn't they tend to react violently to oxygen?
Yes, I mean the fuel itself is a high temperature molten salt, which is very corrosive. You have to control the chemistry very carefully. It has to be kept isolated from fluids like water, moisture, or even air. There are a whole range of potential, corrosion and other chemical effects which have to be managed in this very high temperature salt. So that's certainly one of them.
And we have a question here from Christine Gibson. She's in Northern Ireland, where we do not yet have any nuclear plants to date, but we are facing many developments that could facilitate the creation of SMRs in the future. What should we be looking out for? For example, new CO2 storage areas, Canadian investment into mining in conjunction with nearby new electricity grid developments. They're not so transparent here until it's too late and done and dusted. Thank you for any heads up. What should she be looking out for so they can keep them away from the door?
I guess there you should be looking out for Rolls-Royce.
Rolls-Royce, which has declared in public documentation that it's very much tied, I believe, to the nuclear weapons section of, that this is why they're really in business. There's a question here from Robert Scheidau about Canada. I was wondering, in general, have there been studies to show that nuclear plants are increasing the temperatures of the local bodies of water? The Bay of Fundy is rapidly warming. Could the reactors that are already in place be playing a role in these increases? This is not strictly related to SMRs, but I suppose speaks to whether that load would be amplified should Canada and specifically New Brunswick add more reactors to the coastline there.
So, I mean, as a physicist, I would say that, when you set up any kind of a thermal power plant, whether it's a coal plant or a natural gas plant or a nuclear plant, you would be discharging hot water typically into one of these water bodies, and the temperature there is going to go up a little bit. But if you think about, depending on the size of the water body, that increase in temperature can be sizable or small. So if it's, for example, the ocean, then the effects of that tend to be fairly localized. Now, local does not mean zero. It means that for the people who live very nearby, there is going to be certainly an effect. And we've heard sort of at least anecdotal stories about fisher folk in various parts of the world complaining about the changes in fishing patterns near nuclear plants as well as other fossil fuel plants.
Thanks. And I'm keeping an eye on the time here, but we've still got quite a lot of people, over 200 people still participating. So I think if it's all right with you, we'll go a little bit longer. This question is actually for you, Ed, from Paige Murphy-Young. And she asks, when an SMR applicant submits its plan to address a new scale type design flaw, will NRC have staff commitment to review such a quote unquote cure independently? Alternatively, is NRC authorized to outsource its oversight like FAA and Boeing?
Okay, I'll answer the second question first. And the answer is no. Things at the NRC are not quite that bad yet as they are at the FAA, where the industry could actually be hired to work in the agency to review its own application. Things aren't quite that bad, but there is a trend at the NRC toward reducing its own independent oversight and allowing reactor licensees to do more, to take more credit for their own self-inspections. It hasn't quite gone that far, but it's going in that direction, and obviously that increases conflict of interest issues and is problematic. With respect to the first, so the way the licensing process works is, if an applicant wants to build a new scale or apply for what's called a combined operating license, which would allow them to actually build a new scale plant, they would have to have various procedures to deal with potential recovery actions or operator actions that might be needed. Those procedures might not actually be part of the application itself, but they could just have to make a commitment that they would develop those plans, which might not even be reviewed by the NRC. So one of the concerns of this advisory committee on reactor safeguards, or at least one of the members, was that by approving the design and pushing off these questions about managing these operational issues later, there's no guarantee that a future NRC review would take those seriously. In fact, the ACRS, this one member, is writing his own letter, which is very unusual, to the commission, urging them to ensure that that does happen. It's almost like a historical marker saying, when you come back to this, here's the marker saying you have to look at this, because he was afraid that it isn't going to be dealt with in the future to the extent it should be. So it is a concern.
There have been a couple of, I'm sort of bundling a couple of last questions together now. I mean, there were some sort of rather fundamental questions like, what does it even mean, modular? Why are they called modular reactors? And then Scott Portsline did ask, will all modular reactors have containment buildings? Anybody like to answer? And Gordon, you are unmuted as well, so if you want to chime in, please do.
Yes, well, actually, as I understand it, there are really two uses for the word modular. One is they can be considered modular in the sense that you can stack multiple units so that you can build up a large capacity in one spot by simply putting several small modular reactors together. For example, the NuScale plant that wants to put 12 different small modular reactors together as a kind of a network of interacting nuclear reactors. This was referred to earlier in terms of risk, because the risk of a meltdown is multiplied by 12 simply by having those 12 reactors. And that makes the possibility of a meltdown or a nuclear accident actually quite a bit greater than it would be, significantly greater than it would be for one single large reactor. As far as containment goes, containment is massive. It uses up a lot of space. And because they're looking for small, they try to minimize the containment, and they try to justify this by the technology they're using, and really saying that we cannot have releases because we're using an inherently safe technology. But the reason why nuclear reactors are unsafe is because they're not just machines for generating electricity, they're also warehouses of radioactive poisons. Anything that destroys that warehouse, whether it's an attack by bombing from above during warfare or sabotage, or just some kind of unforeseen accident like a plane crash, can release an enormous amount of radioactive material, which will then be in the environment and working its way through the food chain for many, many centuries to come. So to call them safe, you can't imagine an accident involving, say, windmills or solar collectors that would be anywhere close to catastrophic compared with the detonation or explosion of one of these small modular reactors. And obviously, they cannot have the same degree of integrity in terms of containment as the large reactors, because otherwise they couldn't be small.
Thanks, Gordon. A couple of last things. So thorium came up a couple of times in the Q&A, but my understanding is that thorium is not really a factor specifically to SMRs. So correct me if I'm wrong, Gordon and Ed and Ramana, and we can answer those questions perhaps offline.
Well, I could say something about that if you don't mind. I think it is a very important question. The point is there's only one material in nature, naturally occurring material, which can be used to make atomic bombs or run a reactor, and that's uranium-235. That's it. That's all there is. Now, there are a couple of man-made materials which can also be used for both purposes, to make bombs or to make fuel nuclear reactors. One of them is plutonium, which is produced as a byproduct from uranium inside the reactor. So it's a derivative of uranium, you could say. The other is a non-natural, an isotope of uranium that does not occur in nature, called uranium-233, and that's a derivative of thorium. So the problems of proliferation associated with using uranium reactors to produce plutonium, and those plutonium can then be used to make bombs galore, those same problems are paralleled when we talk about thorium reactors, which they do not produce plutonium, but yes, they produce uranium-233, which is an extremely powerful nuclear explosive, and which is produced at 100% enrichment, something that we can't even possibly achieve with uranium-235. So yes, the thorium reactor is simply trying to confuse people into thinking that because it doesn't produce plutonium, it's not a proliferation risk. It is.
Thanks, Gordon. I think just to wrap up, as Roger Witherspoon corrected me in the Q&A, the politicians really talk mostly about jobs when they are trying to promote small modular reactors, and possibly less about climate change. And I think that the jobs issue has very much come up, I know, in the UK and elsewhere, as this is going to be a sort of panacea solution. And so I was just wondering, in wrapping up, whether you each could perhaps address the sort of the jobs myth, apart from the fact that they could be a very long way off, whether or not this is really what it's cracked up to be, because it would seem to be a very useful counterpoint to that argument made by some of our elected officials. I'm not sure who'd like to go.
Well, here's the thing, as our potential next vice president likes to say. Here's the thing, is that, of course, the SMR vendors are all arguing that they can build this with more quickly, with lower capital costs, with less materials, and then operate them with fewer operators, fewer security officers, less maintenance, etc. All that means they're trying to argue that the actual personnel resources are going to be much less. So if they're right, if they can achieve these things, then the number of jobs, both short-term and long-term, per installed megawatt are going to be smaller than they are for large reactors, and so they're undermining their own argument when they call for these reductions in personnel.
And a quick question then, because they say, well, they'll be factory produced. So presumably that means that the on-site jobs particularly would go down, would they? Because obviously when it's being put forward, for example, to Trawsfynydd, which is in Wales and is a depressed area, they're being told now that your reactors are closed, we're going to bring back employment. But if they're going to truck this reactor in ready-made, is that really a boon to the local economy?
Well, that's a good question. And I think it's also important to realize that there are so many competing models. We're talking about over 100 different models. To me, it almost sounds, as Ramana described it earlier, with all these small little companies that are just looking for an opportunity to build small modular reactors. They think it's a way, it's almost like a gold rush. It's almost like these prospectors heading off to the Yukon. Anybody can go, anybody can propose a small modular reactor design, but how many are going to be able to corner the market enough to be able to justify the expense of building an actual manufacturing plant? If you don't have a market for hundreds or thousands of customers, it's not worth building a manufacturing plant. So these things that are built one at a time before they built a mass production plant are going to be extremely expensive.
Well, thank you so much. I would like to invite all our speakers to turn their cameras back on. I think, Ramana, you wanted to just say a last word.
One word about jobs. I think that, yes, there are going to be jobs, but the question is, what is the investment that has to be made in order to create those jobs, and do those same amount of investments in other technologies create more jobs? And how are these jobs spread out, and so on? So if it's a question of employing nuclear engineers, then of course, nuclear engineers are going to be employed only when there are SMRs and nuclear reactors, right? But if you're looking at sort of construction jobs or all kinds of other jobs, then other technologies do much better. I think that's the way to approach this.
Very good. Well, thank you again to our wonderful speakers for your time today. Thank you also to Susan O'Donnell and the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development, New Brunswick, and to all of you who joined us today. We had an enormous turnout. Most of you are still with us, so we appreciate you coming on board. As we mentioned at the top and during the program, this was recorded, so you will find the video on YouTube. We will publicize the link widely. And if we did not get to your questions, and there were some questions in there which were really seeking information, we will circulate those to our speakers and endeavor to answer them on email. So apologies if you didn't get your question asked. We won't overlook it. We will endeavor to answer all of them over the course of the next week or so. So without further ado, I guess we can say thank you again from everybody who participated from all across the world, and we appreciate you listening in today and watching, and hopefully we'll do some more of these down the road. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Linda. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everybody.